Some bus and jeepney operators managed to continue operating under lockdowns and severe capacity restrictions through the service contracting program. Motor Inform discusses how this helped PUV drivers and operators under severe community quarantine restrictions.
Bus and jeepney drivers were among those hit hard by the COVID-19 pandemic. At first, all public transport was suspended, and when allowed to resume, severe capacity restrictions as well as health protocols were imposed. To help jeepney and bus drivers continue to provide services to APORs, or authorized persons outside residents and essential workers, the DOTR and line agency, the LTFRB, came up with the Service Contracting Program, or SCP. The SCP provides operators and drivers an opportunity to earn based on the number of trips they run per week while still charging fare. This way, PUV operations are made sustainable whether they have passengers or not. Transportation Secretary Arthur Togade crisscrossed the country to encourage more participation in the SCP, which had an allocation of 5.56 billion pesos under Republic Act 11494 or the Bayanihan to Recover as One Act. The SCP was later used to support IATF and DOTR initiatives to provide free transport to health workers in Metro Manila during community quarantine restrictions. These initiatives, the SCP and the free transport for health and other essential workers, were later extended to other regions and expanded to cover all APORs. The SCP was launched in November of 2020 and was to end in June of 2021. When it ended, only 1.49 billion pesos had been dispensed, and the rest of the funds were supposed to be returned to the Department of Budget Management. However, Secretary Togade and the IATF Committee on Transportation Chairman Edgar Sarmiento convinced the President to allocate 3.38 billion pesos in special funds for participants of Phase 1 of the SCP. This will pay for the 4,000 peso initial payout to participants, the weekly payouts, and the 25,000 peso and 20,000 peso one-time onboarding incentive to operators and drivers participating in Phase 1 of the SCP. These are distributed to operators and drivers through direct deposits to their land bank accounts or their e-wallets such as GCash. By this time, as promised by the LTFRB, the entire 3.38 billion pesos would have already been distributed to SCP Phase 1 participants. Meanwhile, it was decided to relaunch the SCP with new 3 billion peso funding for Phase 2 of the program provided under the 2021 General Appropriations Act. Again, the rationale for the SCP is to protect the livelihoods of transportation workers affected by the COVID-19 restriction, while helping with the free ride for health workers in APORs in Metro Manila and other regions. During the relaunch, Secretary Arthur Togade said the SCP has been good for everyone, the community, the economy, and for trade to grow even under pandemic conditions.
It was inevitable, with COVID-19 still being around, that the government would continue providing incentives to drivers and operators. In turn, they can continue to provide transport services to the public. That's our Motor Inform this week, courtesy of Suzuki Philippines.